Jesus freak here, and I know in the traditions outside of Catholic or Anglican roots, you don't usually find churches that rely on the lectionary, but the church I go to does use it. And last Sunday, we read John 10:22 through 30 for gospel reading. Now, the important part of that, from this perspective, the last of these verses is Jesus says, "I and my Father are one." And yet, there's times when it's pretty obvious that they're two. For example, there's a couple times when Jesus is talking to the Father and the Father speaks back out of a thundercloud or whatever. Um, for example, John 12:28. Or also there's Matthew 3:17. Matthew 17:5. So, what is I and my Father are one? Well, they're one in the sense that they're both God. As Paul says, first of all, in Colossians 1:15, who is the image of the invisible God. In other words, we can't see God, the Father, but we can perceive him through God the Son. And also later in the same letter, where in 2:9 he says, "For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily." And of course, Jesus says that God is a spirit, referring to the Father. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole body versus soul versus spirit, Brian Denlinger way of identifying his interpretation of God. But the idea that God can be three and one at the same time, obviously, it's not a new idea, as some try to claim. And it's pretty clear that the Father and Son are both one and more than one at the same time. Jesus uses the phrase "I am" frequently in the book of John. The King James Version, obviously, in most of these cases, cuts this down to I am he, but the words just mean I am. And for example, you'll find in other translations, like the Reina Valera, they do just say I am, or the equivalent of I am in the various languages for these. There's a reason for Jesus using the phraseology I am, and it is a reference to the Father referring to himself as I am that I am, or really more like I am the am, so to speak, as he does in Exodus 3:14. I believe the translation in both Greek and Latin is I am the is, so to speak. Anyway, Jesus uses this to connect himself to the Father, to show that he is what the Father is. And yet he's not the Father, but he is what the Father is. And that's the idea, what he is and what the Father is and what the Holy Spirit is basically the same thing. The same substance is the technical terminology. And yet, they're obviously distinct. At the same time, they're obviously the same. And that's the kind of thing I was depicting in an earlier video with the Trinity Shield. Which is quite the ancient depiction of this concept of being three in one at the same time. And in the same sense, the idea of God being capable of existing outside of time and space, you have Jesus before Abraham was I am. And a lot of translators have trouble with this phrasing because a present is being put before a past chronologically. But God exists outside of time and space. So it's not to say before Abraham was, I was. It's before Abraham was, I am. Because he's not limited by our measly four-dimensional time space. But it's not something that we, as limited to a four-dimensional time space, can understand. Jesus freak out.